Hi, welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes where we discussed The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This episode, we will begin our first discussion on Black Klansman by Ron Stallworth, who we will also be interviewing about his memoir at the El Paso Community College's Literary Fiesta. My name is Vanessa, and this is Literally Literary, which is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP.
It's good to have you all listeners back. We're really excited to have Ron here next week at the Literary Fiesta and pick his brain a little bit about the book and the film as well, the film adaptation. Richie, did you...
Hi. Yes, I did. What's the question?
No, did you want to say anything as your intro?
Oh, well, hey, guys. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in once again. Looking forward to talking to Ron as well next week at the Literary Fiesta. I hope you guys get to, invite you to check it out. So where can people check that out?
Yes, so that'll be right here in El Paso and downtown in the main branch of the library downtown from 12 to 5. And it's a free event. So it's a free screening as well. We got the right to the film. But, we don't want to talk too much about the film today so that y'all can enjoy it the day of. Mm-hmm. So, Vanessa, did you want to start us off by talking about the first passage you mentioned?
Well, I think if you guys aren't from El Paso or listening in, what should we know about Ron Stallworth and his book here before we even dive into it? What's interesting to know about that?
Yeah. Sorry, I have a tendency to just jump straight into it.
Right.
So he has a very interesting life story that he memorialized here, where, if you're unfamiliar, so he was born in Chicago, but he ended up moving here, and he talks a lot about how here it was a different environment than also being as a cop in Colorado, which is what the most of the book was
Colorado
about.
Springs.
Yeah, Colorado Springs. And so his time there is what eventually became adapted into the film by Spike Lee, where he went undercover, duping David Duke and company into thinking that he was, what the book is called, a Black Klansman. Well, white actually, but he, of course, he's black.
Hence the title.
Hence the name.
Cue title.
Yes. Klansman. And so speaking of his background, I hear he's also a not just a writer of his own story, but he's dabbled in books on hip-hop pedagogy. Which is really interesting. I think it's progressive, and it shows that he's open-minded about how we teach our kids. The idea that there's something to learn from hip-hop, right, as opposed to just jazz.
Dismissing it.
Yeah, dismissing it or relegating it to the idea that it's just kind of another symptom of black youth or whatever it might be, that the negative associations they have with it.
Yeah, these it's like a deconstruction of the narratives we hear.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Stallworth quickly overnight became an El Paso celebrity because of this book and the movie. All right, let's dive into the book.
So the first passage that I actually wanted to talk about was actually about how he grew up here in El Paso.
Yeah.
More specifically, how he was growing up here during the civil rights movement, and how he didn't feel like it was something he was experiencing firsthand, more specifically. Mm-hmm. He describes it as something that he watched on TV, and that it was not something that was happening in his backyard because of how El Paso is so diverse, and it is a very liberal city, even though it is a southern state. Mm-hmm. So I just really like
and very multicultural. I picked up on that right away as well, because a lot of us know in the region already, but I'm thinking mid 60s, the Texas Western basketball team, 1966, coached by Don Haskins, right? Mm-hmm. Which is notorious for, of course, being like the first, all African American starting team, to win a championship in Texas.
Yeah.
The national championship.
Yeah.
And so, I think, and I think he even mentions like because of Fort Bliss and just kind of you look at El Paso history, there's been so many different countries, that have been through Texas mainly, but it's been different countries. We see. So yeah, I'm glad that he kind of provides his lens very early on that his experience here on the border is very different than when he experiences in Colorado Springs, which is most of the book.
Yeah. And in your experience, Vanessa, how do you feel about El Paso now? Right. So this was in the 60s. We're now, 56 years from then. How do you feel your experience being here, living here, compared to like your travel to AWP in Oregon or any other cities?
I think El Paso is definitely very much so still very diverse. We're very multicultural. We have people from like all over the world that live here and visit here even. I don't know. There's just like, there's so many different aspects that you can see, like just living here. Like you meet a bunch of different people from different backgrounds, especially because we do have Fort Bliss here. Like we have a lot of military that comes through here. So they're bringing different cultures also. So I feel like that's still very prominent here in El Paso.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of those different communities, right? There's a big Jewish community, a big Asian community, and of course a big Mexican immigrant community, right? The majority. And the closer you get to the border, what I find fascinating about El Paso is someone who was raised in here in Juarez and El Paso, like, is the closer you get to the border, the more it kind of stops being El Paso, because like it's like they're speaking Spanish and like all the signs are in Spanish, and of course part of it is unfortunately there's that kind of segregation where thinking about the founding of El Paso, right, and how the West Side became kind of like a white community and the Lower Valley became the Mexican American community, right? But part of it is also just the rich cultures that we can find in every corner of the city, right? And I've heard people say who visit that in other cities, other major cities, that the sides of town that we have, the east side, the northeast, and the west side, and central and the lower valley, they would consider them like different suburbs, right? And so it's kind of interesting how some people conceive of what our city is and how they think about the different sides of town.
Yeah, people do treat it essentially like that. I remember I grew up on the east side.
Yeah.
And so when I moved by UTEP, I had a friend who like swears it was like I'm moving to another city.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yeah, it's just down I-10.
Yeah, right around the corner almost.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad that he does kind of reference El Paso so heavily, and we'll come back to El Paso later on in the book when he talks about the KKK connection to it, which isn't a good connection. Other than that, Vanessa, was there something like towards the beginning of the book that kind of struck you about what is those listeners who haven't read the book, what is his main plan here that he answers from an advertisement that he sees on the paper?
Oh, okay. So, the beginning of the book I really found interesting because he doesn't start at the beginning of his investigation. He starts at the beginning of his career as a cadet. And so he kind of leads into it by like describing every little thing that happened before he found out about this advertisement in the newspaper, which is very like bold. Like they specifically wrote Ku Klux Klan, contact here, kind of thing, which is like, how can you do that?
When he, well, even I think the first page even mentions like you're actually, as a detective, he was pretty impressed by the kind of things people would advertise in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Now, also, even before he answers the ad, I think it's important to note that about his hire.
Oh, yes, yes. So, I don't know if you had also marked this passage, y'all, but on page 25, I found really interesting the dynamic of him being a black cop. So if I could just read that real quick. This is on page 25. Um, and so so this is in a scene where he is ordered to investigate Stokely Carmichael, who is this leader, Pan-Africanist, and he talks a little bit about how, you know, as a cop, like he's working undercover here, but of course the cover is easy for him, right? Because he can blend right in, but he also wants to, he does talk a lot. Like one of the insights of the book to me is talking a lot about the undercover process and how, you try to blend in different ways. Like so what do you do if someone pulls a gun out and he says, well, because you have you're wired, you would say that out loud so that you know that you have backup, and so you don't just rush into pulling out your own gun or blowing your own cover, right, and jeopardizing the mission in turn. So I did find that really interesting because it kind of gives us that background into the way that works. But what I wanted to point out about this was on that page that I mentioned, 25, where he says, speaking of how he would be viewed by the people there, he says, "To them, I was not a black man, but rather a police officer who happened to be black. In their eyes, I was a quote-unquote traitor to the cause for which a black revolutionary brother like Stokely had dedicated his life and was here to speak about." And a little further down, he talks about, Stokely wanting to bring down the white man and a racist-centered society and dominant governance structure where brothers like me were caught in another world common to black officers, a quote-unquote phantom-like void in which we were too black for the white community we served, as well as some of the fellow officers, and too blue for the color of the uniform we wore for fellow soul brothers steeped in the cause of civil rights, social revolution beneficial for the black community. I just really find this is one of the most fascinating passages to me because it's a marker, right, of the stigma that comes with being a black police officer, and I'm really looking forward to kind of getting him when we talk to him at the Lady Fiesta one-to-one about this. But this was the 60s, right? But even to this day, of course, we still have this stigma because of a lot of police brutality that has happened, and for which the black community has been the receiving end
Black
of
Lives
it.
Matter.
Yeah, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I find it kind of the way I relate it to is having Border Patrol here. So I think of Border Patrol because I'm Mexican, and most Border Patrol are Hispanic or Latinx. And a scholar that I follow on Twitter had interviewed them about, well, why do you become Border Patrol? And not surprisingly, most of them said because of the money. So it's that cognitive dissonance that occurs when you are kind of seen as someone who is, as he said, right in the book, a traitor to your own people and your own cause. And the idea that, you're not black enough, or that you kind of lose your blackness, right, by becoming blue. It's a strange kind of, flip of the hat, right, almost literally. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts about it, but of course, it strikes an even more resonant tone because this book is primarily about him not being black, right? Because he's pretending to be white. So he kind of takes that to another level, right? By being undercover with the KKK through, vicariously, right, through his fellow agent.
That was a lot, man. Yeah. I mean, in a contemporary sense, I've been thinking about that too. Even though this is happening, already so many years ago. In a contemporary sense, you still see a lot of what the United States, what America has become, what our values are in the age of Trump and of high border presidents, and even Black Lives Matter versus the whole Blue Lives Matter thing. I think we've even touched on this in the previous episodes before, right? Like, even though Stallworth is choosing to become an officer and be for the law, right? And yet at the end of the day, you take off the uniform too, right? And so, those I always think those parallels are very interesting to look at, and then we can get into, I was thinking of nowadays, you have these contemporary movements of the KKK being out in public, unhooded, so to speak, being enabled by people in power, namely, Commander in Chief.
Yeah.
I think that's a little sad to see. We're from how it's discussed in the book to the reality of here in 2019. We're still kind of having to have concerns over these relations.
Yeah, exactly. So that was really interesting to me at the beginning when his first mission before he gets involved with the KKK. Vanessa, after that, did you have another passage that you wanted to highlight, like towards the beginning, like?
I'm like looking through all my sticky notes. Not towards the beginning, really.
Okay.
I don't know if you have another one.
Yes, I did. Sorry.
Nice.
He's like, I'm ready.
Well, on 45 or 43, I mean. So once he does answer the ad, of course, it's this really comedic moment, right? Because it's a realization that, wait a minute, like, of course, I can't myself be undercover here, right? So he enlists the help of his fellow police officer, Chuck, to take this on. And so with Chuck here on page 43, I just wanted to highlight briefly the passage about the background of Ken and the clan itself. So on 43, it says, the clan, according to Ken, became his quote-unquote salvation after he had once been shot by some ends, is what and his wife had been raped by several of them. His prejudices toward ends, he said, had really begun after he joined the U.S. Army. I just wanted to highlight this passage briefly because I think it's important to understand the origins of hatred and bigotry that we see with the KKK. And I recently read a book about the White Power movement by the scholar Kathleen Bellow. And she mentions that the Vietnam War was one of the most pivotal moments in U.S. history when it comes to the elevation of white supremacy in the U.S. Going back to Timothy McVeigh, right, and the Oklahoma City bombing. And so I just find it interesting that, this is what is mentioned here with Ken, right, that his prejudices grew supposedly because of his time in the Army. And I think it's important then to think about, well, what role does the Army have, right? When we know that, of course, in the Army, they have a strict code about not tolerating this kind of behavior. What kind of culture are we going in our United States servicemen and women where we could, and trans people as well, that we would allow this kind of thing to just, go, and people in the chain of command, right, commanding officers, just kind of turning a blind eye to it. So I don't know to what extent it exists today, but I just think it's important to note in terms of how there was a lot of disillusionment amongst veterans after Vietnam, and that in part is what fueled them to join the KKK, because they saw it as another way to bond, another way to come together for a cause. In this case, a racist and bigoted cause, right, as opposed to fighting for country, which in itself, many have talked about many scholars talk about and problematize. But of course, just wanted to mention that in terms of how is it that the KKK started growing, and just the role of Vietnam and the in service, right, and how we treat our veterans who come back after the war.
I also found it interesting that throughout the book, there's kind of this theme that they kind of like are trying to rebrand the KKK.
Yes.
And they call it, they like in public, they don't call it the KKK. They call it the cause or
Yes.
the organization.
Yes.
And they refrain from using certain words as
Yeah,
well.
it's
They're trying to have this type of persona and like they want people to receive them in like a positive light rather than the violent light that they were once seen in. So I found that was really interesting that they kind of were trying to do that.
Rebranding is a pretty appropriate term in that sense. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good point, Vanessa, because it brings up on page 50 the mainstreaming of the KKK that came about because of David Duke. And so in this section, right, it's a really interesting history sociologically and sociopolitically, I should say, in terms of how that mainstream became possible. And of course, to those of you who are listening, it should resonate a lot today with, President 45 and what is going on, something that we see in the book itself and in the film about what you mentioned, Richie, the unhooding, right? The fact that it's just they don't even have to hide who they are anymore. It's just a blatant, the alt-right movement, as we should call it, right? Which is basically, it's a euphemism for being a Nazi or someone in the KKK. And here with David Duke, I also found interesting his own, flirtation with political power, right? I mean, it's not just how he tries these euphemisms so that because he himself knows, right, that like the KKK, everyone recognizes as racist, but making it seem as this kind of sterile thing like the organization, right, or the cause, or in public interviews, right, Ron goes into detail about how David Duke is very careful about what he says, right, that he says, well, we don't want, like, we're not racist, we don't, but we just don't believe in racial integration, we don't believe in miscegenation, and so we don't actually, so it's kind of that idea, right, of like what you mentioned, the public persona. But it should ring a bell in terms of today of how is it that this kind of thing can become successful politically, right, for political power, not just for like advocacy itself, right, and like marches and movements and rallies and civilian life. So I think this is another reason why this book is so important, because it does kind of anticipate the problem we have today, the mainstreaming of white supremacy, which unfortunately El Paso bared the brunt of on August 3rd, a day I think that no one in El Paso will ever forget. And I think now everyone remembers where they were that day. And of course, the rise to the presidency of someone who is a white supremacist. There's no calling a spade. We have to call a spade here, and recognize that he is endorsing this kind of violence in our community, right, and right here in El Paso, and amongst other Latinx communities as well, and other people, as African Americans as well.
Yeah. Yeah, man, very salient points. I thought like this would like slowly be released over time, but I think it's better to just jump into it and state that those obvious connections.
Yeah, well, yeah, and since that was at the beginning where we do get that background into David Duke. So after that, when he does eventually start that undercover mission, right, through his buddy cop. There's a lot of coordination between the two. And Vanessa, I think you had mentioned there was a part where he's on the call, right, with David Duke, I believe, and David Duke is all asking him like, or they're talking about talking how someone who is black would talk, right? Like the dialect and so forth. Did you want to highlight that passage?
Sure. Yeah, it's on page 109. And he's on the phone with David Duke. And I guess he had all his, like, buddy cops with him as well. And so he asks him if he would feel, like, how David Duke would feel if there was a black person talking to him on the phone pretending to be a white person. And so it's kind of ironic, I guess, that he is the black person pretending to be white talking to David Duke, asking him this exact question.
He's like, I'd know.
And David Duke, yes, he says, I would be able to tell because black people have a specific way that they speak. And so Ron asks him, like, how would you be able to tell? And David Duke goes on to say that there's specific words that black people pronounce differently. So I felt like that was interesting because I felt like I think it's just a generalization of them, but also like in terms of like the way people speak, I think it's more based on where they're from because certain places have different accents. So me being from El Paso, I have a specific accent, but someone from New York would have even if they were Hispanic as well, would have a different kind of accent. Like I don't think it has anything to do with race, but David Duke in this conversation kind of generalizes it and it's like, oh, because you're black, you only speak a certain way kind of thing. So I felt like that was really interesting.
Yeah, the regional dialects.
Yeah, and I think also besides those generalizations that Ron himself, right, the fallacy that he points out there on 111, about, well, that also includes whites, right, because many people from the South speak like that. What I also found interesting about that is that it's another way to mark the black community as different or inferior, because he's saying that, well, they just don't pronounce certain words right, or they mispronounce words, or like, that idea that like even in academia, sometimes we see it toxically that there's only one way to speak English, right? And that, all these other ways of speaking it, whether it's accents, dialect, slang, etc., is not like, that's not true language, right? Like that, it's a parallel between the purity of the race that, David Duke and his followers want, and the purity of language that I think is just as fallacious, and that Ron, rightfully highlights as such. That was interesting to think of in terms of the markers of like what people associate with being black, right, and how black itself is not just a skin color, but the passing as someone who is black.
Exactly.
In this case, he's passing as someone who is white
over the phone. Yeah, it reminds me of that Boots Riley film, Sorry to Bother You. I don't know if you guys saw that. But
no, I haven't.
It deals with the whole idea of like the white voice, and he.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's, maybe something we can touch on later, but it has to kind of do with the whole idea of passing and this idea of a white voice. And that's always been an interesting topic too, just language, in this debate and like, and speak English, all these kind of things as well, where sometimes you see the proponents of English only aren't that great at English themselves,
Yeah. And it's grounded in I think a racist ideology in and of itself, if you ask me, because it assumes that anyone who doesn't speak it right or write it right is himself inferior in some way. So yeah, that was a really interesting one. Before we dive deeper into what ends up happening, as he gets deeper undercover through Chuck. I just one last passage to highlight towards the beginning on page 74, because I really, for obvious reasons, connected with this one. So I'll just read it. Ken wanted to organize. So Ken, from the KKK, wanted to organize a group to go to El Paso for a border watch, quote unquote. This would mean staking out the border in their cars and trucks with rifles, with scopes and shooting anyone they saw trying to cross the Rio Grande. A clan armed watch along the Rio Grande border of Mexico was in keeping with David Duke's approach to immigration control. And so as much as the KKK is seen as, of course, like racist against blacks and racist against the Jewish community, there's also the connection that we get here to our own city, our own hometown. And I drew obviously the parallels to the modern day, the Minutemen that we see in the border and that we've heard kind of come back because of the central immigrant influx that we've gotten because of, so many refugees and asylees who are now being sent back to Mexico because of what's called the Migrant Protection Protocol, which is really just a reframing of what should really be migrant persecution protocols because of how dangerous it is to wait across the border without having access to resources, including language, right? Because language itself is a form of power. And so it wasn't surprising to find out that the KKK was planning something like this. And it's just even more tragic that, 60, 50 years from then, it hasn't changed. And if anything, it might even be worse because you could argue, of course, that they have more political power now, more political capital.
Exactly.
So that was my connection to the border, what really resonated with me with the book.
You see that proto-Minutemen mentality of we have to defend the border from invaders.
Yeah, and immigration policy, right?
Quote unquote invaders.
Yeah, I mean, back then and with the Minutemen of today, it's more of this like not proto, but just plain a fascist mentality, right? Of like, you can just shoot them, right? I mean, it's violent, but now, it's not just the violence that we, again, burned the brunt of on August 3rd at the Walmart, but also the racist immigrant policy that I mentioned, like the MPP, which is also called the Remain in Mexico policy, is and other racist policies that this administration keeps changing almost daily. And I know this just to the listeners who might be wondering, a lot of us, here in the border know what's going on because of we see it on the news, in the local news. But also I sit on the board of directors for Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center, and I hear a lot of these stories in our monthly meetings. And it just really pains me that we are going this direction. But I do have hope, that we resist, right? That we organize, and we have, right? There's been a lot of rallies, counter rallies to these kinds of things, these kinds of racist movements.
Thanks again for joining us in our discussion on Ron Stallworth's memoir, Black Klansman. For time purposes, this episode has been split into 2 parts. Stay tuned for part 2 of this discussion. If you're listening to this episode before October 19th, 2019, be sure to check out the Literary Fiesta at our downtown library, where we will be showing the film, as well as interviewing Ron Stallworth himself.